Sometimes a man finds a loyalty so deep that no threat on earth can break it. In the frontier town of Red Butte, mountain man Calder Boone crosses land claimed by outlaw Clay Maddox, and Clay doesn't take kindly to it. He storms into the street, hand on his revolver, shouting threats that echo off every storefront. Calder just stands there, calm as morning mist, letting the outlaw's rage roll past him. Clay's hand moves toward his gun. The townsfolk freeze. Then comes a low growl that stops everything. From behind Calder steps Rook, a wolf dog with scars and eyes that promise violence. The beast plants himself between the men, and Clay's courage drains from his face. What secret lies beneath that disputed land, and why would Calder risk everything to cross it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days earlier, the sun had barely cleared the eastern ridgeline when Calder Boone rode into Red Butte with nothing but a bedroll, a worn leather satchel, and a wolf dog that made grown men step back from their morning coffee. The town wasn't much to look at. A single dirt road lined with weather-beaten structures that leaned into the wind like old men too tired to stand straight. False-fronted buildings promised more than they delivered. A general store, a saloon with cracked windows, a land office that hadn't seen fresh paint in a decade, and a jail that looked like it might collapse if you leaned on it too hard. Calder was a man carved from the same stone as the mountains he called home. 53 years had etched lines deep into his face, each one a story of winters survived and hardships endured. His beard was more grey than brown now, trimmed close but not neat, and his eyes carried that particular shade of blue you only find in high country lakes, clear, cold, and deeper than they first appeared. He sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, moving with the animal rather than against it, and when he dismounted in front of the general store, his movements were deliberate and economical. No wasted motion, no hurry. Rook padded beside him, massive head level with Calder's hip. The animal was something between wolf and dog, though which side won out depended on the moment. His coat was grey and black, thick enough to turn away winter wind, and scarred enough to tell you he'd survived things that would have killed a softer creature. One ear had a notch torn from it. His eyes were amber, intelligent and constantly watchful. When Calder stopped, Rook stopped. When Calder moved, Rook moved. They were bound by something deeper than training, something that looked like partnership from the outside, but felt more like brotherhood from within. The general store's door announced their arrival with a rusty bell. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, dried tobacco, and old wood. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with essentials: flour, beans, ammunition, fabric, tools. A woman stood behind the counter, maybe 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had seen enough of life to be wary, but not unkind. She looked at Calder, then at Rook, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe, or memory. Help you? She asked, her voice carrying the roughness of someone who'd spent years breathing dust. Need some supplies? Calder said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made people lean in to listen, rather than forcing them back with volume. And information, if you're willing. Supplies I can do. Information depends on what you're asking. She began gathering items as Calder listed them: coffee, jerky, ammunition for his rifle. Her hands moved with the efficiency of long practice. I'm looking for records, Calder said. Land records. Going back 20, maybe 30 years, the woman's hands paused, just for a heartbeat. Land office is 3 doors down. Though I'll warn you, the clerk there isn't particularly helpful unless you've got the right encouragement. The kind that jingles or the kind that threatens. A slight smile touched her lips. The former, usually. Though lately, the latter works better if it comes from Clay Maddox. She set the supplies on the counter and looked at him directly. You don't strike me as one of his men. I'm not. Then you should probably know that Clay Maddox owns most of the land around Red Butte. What he doesn't own, he controls. And he doesn't take kindly to strangers asking questions about property lines. Calder nodded slowly, absorbing this. You got a name? Eliza Brennan. I've run this store for 32 years. Seen this town go from decent to desperate. She wrapped his supplies in brown paper, tying it with practiced efficiency. You planning on stirring up trouble with Maddox? Planning on finding some truth. If that stirs up trouble, so be it. Eliza studied him for a long moment. And in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, maybe, or a recognition of kindred spirits who'd both lost things that couldn't be replaced. You remind me of someone, she said finally. Woman who came through here 5 years back, had that same look about her, determined, quiet about it but determined. Calder's hand went to his chest, where beneath his shirt hung a chain with a wedding band. Dark hair, green eyes, voice like morning birdsong. Eliza's eyes widened slightly. Sarah Boone, you knew her. She was my wife. The words settled in the air like dust after a wind. Eliza's expression softened, and something like sorrow crossed her weathered face. I'm sorry for your loss. She was a good woman, spoke of you often during her time here. What was she doing in Red Butte? Same as you, I suspect. Looking into land records. She mentioned her family once owned property near here. Said she wanted to understand what happened to it. Eliza glanced toward the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers. She left town sudden-like. Few days after she'd been asking questions. Heard later she'd taken ill. Calder's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She died 3 months after leaving here. Doctor said it was her heart, but Sarah had a strong heart. Strongest woman I ever knew. Sometimes the strongest hearts break in ways we can't see, Eliza said gently. Then after a pause, though sometimes they're helped along, the implication hung between them. Calder's hand rested on the counter, and Rook, sensing some shift in his companion's mood, pressed against his leg. The land she was asking about, Calder said. Would that be the stretch that runs along Copper Creek? The section with the old stand of cottonwoods. Eliza's silence was answer enough. That's what I thought. Calder paid for his supplies and turned to leave, then paused. You said Maddox owns most of the land around here. How'd he come by it? Same way men like him always do. Fear, intimidation, and creative paperwork. Anyone who challenged him either left town or stopped talking. She met his eyes. You seem like a man who doesn't scare easy, Mr. Boone, but I'd advise caution. Clay's got a dozen men who'll kill on his word, and a sheriff who's too afraid to stop them. I appreciate the warning. As Calder stepped back into the sunlight, an older man with a black medical bag was crossing the street. He moved with the careful gait of someone whose bones remembered every hard winter. And when he saw Rook, he stopped dead. That's a wolf, he said, though his tone suggested curiosity more than fear. Half wolf. Their half's loyalty. Calder studied the man. You the town doctor? Doc Harlan. Been patching up this town for 23 years. He approached slowly, and Rook's amber eyes tracked every movement. May I? He asked, gesturing toward the animal. At Calder's slight nod, Doc Harlan extended his hand slowly. Rook sniffed once, then allowed the touch. The doctor ran his fingers over the old scars with professional interest. He's been through some battles. We both have. Doc Harlan looked up at Calder, and in his eyes was the same recognition Eliza had shown. The look of someone seeing echoes of the past in the present. You're Calder Boone, aren't you? Sarah's husband. Word traveled fast in small towns, apparently. I am. She spoke of you. Said you were a man who kept his promises. Doc Harlan straightened, his expression grave. I was the one who examined her when she came through here. Thought she had a stomach ailment. Gave her some tonic, told her to rest. If I'd known... He stopped himself, old guilt evident in the lines of his face. Known what? The symptoms. They were consistent with something else. Something I didn't want to believe. He glanced around, then lowered his voice. You planning to stay in Red Butte long? As long as it takes. Doc Harlan nodded slowly. Then you should know, you're not the first to come looking for answers. And you may not be the last to leave in a pine box. He touched his hat in farewell. But if you need anything, medical attention, information, or just someone to watch your back, you know where to find me. As the doctor walked away, Calder stood in the middle of Red Butte's main street with his supplies and his wolf dog, feeling the weight of watching eyes from windows and doorways. This town had secrets, and those secrets had killed his Sarah. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages filled with Sarah's careful handwriting. Maps, notes, questions she'd never gotten to answer. He'd promised her in those final days, when the light was leaving her eyes, that he'd find the truth, that he'd see justice done. It had taken him 5 years to track down the threads she'd left behind, 5 years to work up the courage to follow her path. Now he was here, and he wasn't leaving until those promises were kept. Rook pressed against his leg again, a silent reassurance. Calder ran his hand over the animal's scarred head and opened the journal to a map Sarah had drawn. The disputed land was marked in her neat hand, along with a single word, mine. Not in the possessive sense, he understood now. She'd marked the location of a mine. Tomorrow he'd ride out there and see what was worth killing for. Tonight he'd make camp outside town and study every word Sarah had written, searching for the truth in the margins of her careful notes. The sun was setting behind Red Butte, painting the buildings in shades of amber and red. When Calder found a spot on the northern edge of town, he built a small fire, more for light than warmth, and laid out his bedroll. Rook circled 3 times before settling beside him, and together they watched the darkness settle over the frontier town like a shroud. Calder opened Sarah's journal and read by firelight, his finger tracing the words she'd written 5 years ago. "The land belongs to my family by right and law," one entry said, "but Maddox has papers that say otherwise. How can 2 truths exist in the same place?" She'd been close to something, close enough to be dangerous, and now Calder was following in her footsteps, carrying her questions forward into whatever answers waited in the dust and blood of Red Butte. He touched the wedding band hanging from his neck and made a silent promise to the night, to Sarah's memory, to the part of him that still believed in justice. He would find the truth, and he would make it matter. Rook's low growl interrupted his thoughts, not a warning, just an acknowledgement. The wolf dog had his head raised, ears forward, watching something in the darkness beyond the firelight. Calder followed his gaze but saw nothing except shadows. "Easy, friend," he murmured. "We've got time. Tomorrow we'll see what all the fuss is about." But time, as it turned out, was something Clay Maddox wouldn't give them. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning that made a man grateful for coffee and a good fire. Calder had both, along with the company of a wolf dog who'd already caught and eaten his breakfast somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness. Rook returned to camp with blood on his muzzle and satisfaction in his amber eyes, settling down to watch Calder prepare for the day ahead. The ride out to the disputed land took less than an hour. Calder followed Sarah's map, tracing the route she'd marked 5 years earlier with careful attention to landmarks. A lightning-struck pine, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, the bend in Copper Creek, where the water ran swift and cold. Every detail she'd noted was exactly where she'd said it would be, and Calder felt her presence in those observations. The way she'd always noticed things others missed, the land itself was beautiful in the way only wild country could be. Rolling hills covered in sage and wild grass, stands of cottonwood along the creek, and in the distance, the mountains rising like ancient sentinels. It was the kind of place a man could build a life, raise cattle, maybe even find peace. Calder understood why Sarah's family had claimed it, and why someone like Clay Maddox would kill to keep it. He dismounted near the cottonwoods and let his horse drink from the creek while he walked the property lines Sarah had marked. The old survey stakes were still there, weathered but visible if you knew where to look. And there, carved into a cottonwood trunk almost obscured by bark growth, were initials, J.C. 1847, James Carson, Sarah's grandfather. Calder pulled out the tin-type photograph he carried in his shirt pocket, protected by oilcloth and worn from handling. Sarah stood in front of these very same cottonwoods, young and vibrant, maybe 19 or 20 years old. The photo had been taken before they'd met, before life had written its stories across both their faces. She was smiling, one hand resting on the trunk of the tree, claiming her place in this landscape. He was so focused on the photograph, on the memories it carried, that he didn't hear the riders until Rook's growl brought him back to the present. 6 men on horseback emerged from the tree line, spreading out in a semicircle that spoke of practiced intimidation. In the center rode Clay Maddox, and even if Calder hadn't known the name, he would have recognized the type. Mid-40s, well-fed in a place where most men were lean from hard work, wearing clothes that cost more than a month's wages for a ranch hand. His horse was too fine for everyday riding, his gun belt too ornate for practical use, and his face carried the particular smugness of a man who'd never been told no. Beside him rode a scarred brute of a man with dead eyes and a gun worn low on his hip. "Pike," called a guest. The enforcer Eliza had mentioned without mentioning. "You're on private property," Clay announced, his voice carrying the forced authority of someone used to being obeyed out of fear rather than respect. Calder folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his pocket. "I'm on property that belonged to James Carson, legally purchased in 1847. "That's so." Clay's smile was thin and cold. "Funny, because my papers say I bought this land 15 years ago from a man named Garrett Hodge, who bought it from the territorial government when Carson abandoned it. James Carson didn't abandon anything. He was forced off by men with guns who didn't like the color of his daughter's husband." Calder's voice remained steady, conversational even. "His daughter Sarah inherited the claim, and when she came here 5 years ago to reclaim what was hers, she ended up dead 3 months later." Something flickered in Clay's eyes. Surprise, maybe, that this stranger knew so much. Or calculation about what that knowledge meant. "A lot of people die," Clay said. "It's the nature of life out here. Hard country takes hard tolls. Some tolls are collected by the land, others by men who think they're above justice." Pike's hand drifted toward his gun. "You calling Mr. Maddox a murderer?" "I'm stating facts. Sarah Boone came to Red Butte asking questions about this land. She left sick and died shortly after. Now I'm here asking the same questions." Calder's hand rested casually near his rifle, still in its scabbard on his saddle. "Makes a man wonder what's on this property that's worth killing for." Clay's face flushed red, veins standing out on his neck. "You got a lot of nerve, stranger. Riding onto my land, making accusations. You know what we do to trespassers out here." "I know what you think you do. But I also know the law, and I know the truth. This land belongs to Sarah's estate, which means it belongs to me as her widower." "Your wife's dead," Clay spat. "Dead people don't own property." "No, but their heirs do. And I've got the original deed, signed and witnessed, dated 1847. I've got survey records, tax payments, and a family tree that proves Sarah Carson Boone was James Carson's granddaughter." Calder met Clay's eyes without flinching. "What have you got besides forged papers and a reputation for violence?" The other riders shifted in their saddles. These were hired guns, loyal to Clay's money more than Clay himself, and Calder could see them calculating odds and weighing risks. A man willing to stand alone against 6 armed men was either stupid or dangerous, and Calder didn't carry himself like a stupid man. Pike cleared his throat. "Want me to handle this, boss?" Clay raised a hand, his eyes never leaving Calder. "Not yet. I want to give our friend here a chance to reconsider his position." He leaned forward in his saddle. "You ride out of Red Butte today, right now, and we'll forget this conversation happened. You'll live to see another sunrise." "That's a generous offer." "I appreciate the offer," Calder said. "But I didn't ride all this way to turn back at the first threat. I made a promise to my wife. I intend to keep it." "Then you're a fool," Clay snapped. "You think you can come into my town, onto my land, and challenge me? I own the sheriff. I own half the businesses. I own the territorial judge who will rule on any land dispute." "You're alone, old man." "Alone and outgunned. Maybe not as alone as you think." The voice came from behind Clay's men. They spun in their saddles to find Doc Harlan sitting his horse at the edge of the clearing, a rifle resting across his pommel. He wasn't pointing it at anyone, but the threat was implicit. "This doesn't concern you, Doc," Clay said, his voice tight with anger. "A man standing up for what's right always concerns me, especially when that man knew my son." Doc's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. "Thomas came out here 3 years ago, asking questions about this land. He disappeared. I've lived with that mystery long enough. Clay's composure cracked slightly. Your son left town. Decided frontier life wasn't for him. My son's horse came back without him. His saddlebags were intact, his gear untouched. Only thing missing was Thomas himself. Doc Harlan's rifle shifted almost imperceptibly. Now I'm wondering if he's buried somewhere on this disputed land. The tension stretched thin as wire. 6 armed men plus Clay, 2 men standing against them, 1 middle-aged doctor and 1 mountain man. The math wasn't favorable, but Calder had learned long ago that numbers didn't tell the whole story. A man defending the truth had a strength that hired guns couldn't match. And then there was Rook. The wolf dog had been sitting quietly beside Calder, so still he was easy to overlook. But now he rose, every line of his body radiating controlled violence, his lips pulled back from teeth designed to tear and rend. The growl that came from his chest was low, primal, and promised death to anyone who made the wrong move. Clay's horse sidestepped nervously. Pike's hand froze halfway to his gun. The other riders exchanged glances, and Calder could see the calculation changing. Fighting 2 men was one thing. Fighting 2 men and a wolf was something else entirely. This isn't over, Clay said, but his voice had lost its certainty. You've got until sundown to leave Red Butte. After that, I can't guarantee your safety. I never asked you to, Calder replied. Clay wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following. But Pike lingered for a moment, staring at Calder with those dead eyes. I've killed better men than you, he said quietly. Maybe, but I doubt you've killed a man with better reasons. Calder held his gaze until Pike looked away first, spurring his horse to catch up with the others. When they were gone, Doc Harlan rode forward. That was either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. Calder patted Rook's head, praising the animal's timing. I appreciate you showing up when you did. I didn't do it for you, Doc said, though his tone wasn't unfriendly. I did it because I'm tired of watching Clay Maddox destroy everything decent in this town, and because I need to know what happened to Thomas. Calder nodded slowly. Then we've got common cause. But you should know, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Clay's not the kind to back down from a challenge. Neither am I, not anymore. Doc looked out across the disputed land, his eyes distant. I spent 3 years telling myself Thomas just left, that he couldn't handle the frontier, that he went back east without saying goodbye. But I knew. Deep down I always knew. We'll find the truth, Calder promised. For Thomas. For Sarah, for everyone Clay's hurt. They rode back toward Red Butte together, an unlikely alliance born of shared loss and shared purpose. Behind them, the disputed land lay quiet in the morning sun, keeping its secrets for a while longer, but secrets like the dead never stayed buried forever. As they reached the outskirts of town, Sheriff Tom Garrett was waiting. He was a man who'd once been something more, Calder could tell. Shoulders still broad despite age, hands steady, eyes that had seen violence and survived it. But there was a weariness about him, the kind that came from too many compromises with conscience. Heard you had words with Clay, the sheriff said without preamble. More like he had words at me, Calder replied. Oh, just stood my ground. That ground you're standing on is about to become a graveyard if you don't watch yourself. Garrett's eyes moved to Doc Harlan. Both of you. Clay's got the town council in his pocket. He can make your lives very difficult, more difficult than living with the truth buried, Doc asked. The sheriff had no answer for that. He turned his horse and rode away, but not before Calder caught the look in his eyes. Guilt, shame, and maybe a flicker of hope that someone might finally stand up to the tyranny he'd enabled through inaction. In the general store, Eliza was waiting. She'd heard about the confrontation. Word traveled fast in Red Butte, and her face was tight with worry. You've done it now, she said. Clay won't let this go. I'm counting on it. Calder pulled out the tintype and showed it to her. You said Sarah reminded you of me. Did she show you this photograph? Eliza's breath caught. She did. Stood right where you're standing and told me about her grandfather, about the land, about what was stolen. She looked up at Calder. She also told me that if anything happened to her, I should give something to a man named Calder Boone if he ever came looking. She disappeared into the back room, and returned with a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Sarah's handwriting spelled out his name. Calder's hands trembled as he took it. 5 years. 5 years of grief and questions, and here was Sarah's voice reaching out from beyond death. "I haven't opened it," Eliza said softly. "It wasn't meant for me." Calder nodded his thanks and walked outside, Rook at his heels. He sat on the general store's porch, broke the seal, and began to read his wife's final words to him. And with each line, the truth of Red Butte, of Clay Maddox, and of Sarah's death became terribly, devastatingly clear. Deputy Miller's knock came just after sunset, soft but urgent. Calder opened the door with his rifle ready, but the young man's hands were empty. Raised in peace. "I need to talk to you," Miller said. Calder let him in, watching as the deputy's eyes took in the sparse room. The weapon within reach, Rook's vigilant presence. This was a man who'd crossed a line and knew there was no going back. "I've been Sheriff Garrett's deputy for 4 years," Miller began without preamble. "I've watched this town rot from the inside. Watched good people leave or stay silent out of fear. Watched Clay Maddox build an empire on theft and murder." He met Calder's eyes. "I watched Thomas Harlan ride out that morning 3 years ago, and I've lived every day since knowing I should have gone with him." "You were afraid," Calder said. "It wasn't a judgment, just a statement of fact. I was. Still am, if I'm honest. But fear's not a good enough reason to let evil prosper." Miller pulled something from his pocket, a brass compass, dented and scratched. "Found this near the mine entrance 2 weeks after Thomas disappeared. Knew it was his. He used to show it to me, said his father gave it to him when he first wore a badge." Calder took the compass, feeling its weight. "Doc's been looking for this. I know. I should have given it to him years ago, but I was afraid of what it meant. If Thomas died up there, it meant Clay was willing to kill a lawman. And if he'd kill one lawman—" Miller didn't finish the thought. "He'd kill another." Calder handed the compass back. "You should give this to Doc yourself. He deserves to know his son didn't leave willingly." "I will. But first, I need to tell you what I know." Miller sat down heavily, like a man unburdening himself of weight carried too long. "Clay's got at least 12 men working for him now. Pike's the worst of them, but there are others nearly as bad. They rotate watches on the mine, 4 men at a time. The silver's brought out every 3 days, loaded onto wagons in the middle of the night, taken to a rail station 2 territories over. Security at the mine. 2 men on watch, usually. They've got rifles and a clear line of sight on the only approach. Getting in without being seen would be near impossible. Near impossible isn't the same as impossible." Calder was already thinking through approaches, angles, possibilities. "How often does Clay visit the site?" "Once a week, usually Thursdays. Takes Pike and 2 others with him, inspects the operation, checks the output." Miller leaned forward. "That's also when he moves the real money. He doesn't trust banks, keeps most of his silver profits in a safe at the mine office." Calder absorbed this information, filing it away. "Why are you telling me this? You could lose everything, your job, your life, your family's safety, because my daughter's going to grow up in this town. And I want her to grow up knowing her father stood for something when it mattered." Miller's voice was steady, resolved. "Thomas was my friend. He deserved better than what happened to him. And so did your wife." The 2 men sat in silence for a moment, an understanding passing between them. Sometimes courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the choice to act despite it. "Does Garrett know you're here?" Calder asked. "No, the sheriff's a good man, but he's been beaten down by compromise. He knows what Clay is, but he's convinced himself that keeping a fragile peace is better than starting a war he doesn't think he can win. What if he knew he wasn't alone? That there were others willing to stand with him?" Miller considered this. Maybe he's not a coward, just tired. Tired of fighting alone, tired of losing battles. If he thought there was a real chance— He trailed off. "I can talk to him, carefully." They discussed strategy late into the night. The mine was the key. If they could document the illegal operation, get physical evidence, they'd have grounds for an official investigation. Combined with the original deed, Thomas's ledger, and testimony from townspeople, it would be enough to bring down Clay's empire. But it meant going up against armed guards. into territory Clay controlled, and getting out alive with proof that could hang him. "I'll go," Calder said. "Tomorrow night during the next watch rotation. Rook and I can move quiet in the dark." "You'll need backup," Miller insisted. "Someone watching the approaches, ready to create a distraction if things go wrong." "Too risky." "You've got a family, which is exactly why I need to do this." Miller's jaw was set. "What kind of father would I be if I let another man take all the risk while I stayed safe?" Before Calder could argue further, Rook's growl cut through the conversation. Low sustained warning. The wolf dog was at the window, hackles raised, staring down at the street. Calder moved to look. 5 men on horseback, Pike among them, stopping in front of the general store. One dismounted and tried the door. Finding it locked, he pounded on it hard enough to rattle the frame. "Eliza Brennan!" Pike's voice carried in the quiet night. "Open up! We need to have a conversation about harboring criminals." Calder grabbed his rifle. Miller's hand went to his gun. This was the confrontation they'd known was coming, just sooner than expected. "Stay here," Miller said. "I'm still wearing a badge. Let me try to defuse this." "They're past defusing," Calder observed, but he nodded. "I'll cover you from here. If Pike draws, I drop him first." Miller headed downstairs. Calder positioned himself at the window, rifle resting on the sill. Rook remained beside him, every muscle coiled and ready. The deputy stepped out onto the porch, deliberately casual but with his hand near his gun. "Evening, Pike. What's this about?" "Official business, deputy. Need to search the premises. On whose authority?" "Mr. Maddox's. He's got reason to believe Eliza's hiding a wanted man." "Wanted for what crime?" Miller's voice was steady, professional. "Far as I know, there's no warrant out on anyone in Red Butte. Trespassing, theft, threatening a landowner." Pike's dead eyes showed no emotion. "We can do this easy or hard, deputy." "Your choice." "I choose legal," Miller said. "You want to search private property, you get Sheriff Garrett to issue a proper warrant. Until then, you and your boys can ride on back to wherever you came from." The street had gone silent. Windows showed lamplight, but no faces. Townspeople watching, but not willing to be seen watching. This was the moment Red Butte had been dreading, the moment when pretending everything was fine became impossible. Pike's hand drifted toward his gun. "You're making a mistake, boy." "The mistake was made years ago, when we all started looking the other way." Miller's voice carried a new strength, the kind that came from finally choosing a side. "Thomas Harlan was my friend. He was murdered for trying to uphold the law. I'm not making the same mistake he did, going alone. But I'm also not backing down." From the shadows, Doc Harlan emerged, carrying his rifle. Then Eliza, standing in her doorway with a shotgun. Then, surprisingly, the blacksmith, and the owner of the feed store, and the widow who ran the boarding house. One by one, townspeople stepped into the street, armed and resolute. It wasn't many, maybe 15 people total, against Clay's small army. But it was enough to show Pike that the balance had shifted, that the tide of fear that had kept Red Butte compliant was finally turning. Pike looked at the gathered townspeople, calculating odds and considering consequences. His hand moved away from his gun. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Miller agreed. "It's not. But when it is, it'll be the law that finishes it, not thugs in the night." Pike and his men rode off, but the threat in his parting glance was unmistakable. Clay would hear about this. And Clay wouldn't take it well. As the townspeople dispersed, Doc climbed the stairs to Calder's room. Miller followed. The 3 men stood together, knowing they'd just committed to a course that would end in either justice or death. "Tomorrow night," Calder said. "We go to the mine, get the evidence, and finish this." Doc nodded slowly. Miller's hand shook slightly, but his voice was firm when he said, "I'm in." Outside, Red Butte settled into uneasy sleep, no longer able to pretend innocence. The battle lines had been drawn, and come morning, everyone would have to choose which side of history they wanted to stand on. In his grand house, Clay Maddox received Pike's report with mounting rage. This mountain man had done in days what years of intimidation had prevented. He'd given the town courage to resist. That courage would need to be crushed, completely and publicly, before it spread any further. Clay began making plans for the morning. Plans that involved fire and blood, and an example no one in Red Butte would ever forget. The morning came with smoke on the wind. Calder smelled it before he saw it. Acrid, wrong, carrying the scent of burning wood and something worse. He was at the window instantly, Rook beside him, both alert to danger. The feed store was burning. Flames climbed the walls, consuming dry timber like kindling. Clay's men surrounded it, not fighting the fire, but ensuring no one else did either. And in the middle of the street, the feed store owner knelt with his hands tied, Pike standing over him with a gun. This is what happens to traitors. Clay's voice carried across the town, amplified by rage and certainty. He stood on his horse, making sure everyone could see him, hear him. You stand with that mountain man, you stand against me. And standing against me has consequences. Sheriff Garrett was there, trying to intervene, but 4 of Clay's men kept him back. The sheriff's face was twisted with impotent fury, his hand on his gun, but outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Calder grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. Eliza caught his arm. That's what he wants, she said urgently. He's baiting you. The moment you step out there, Pike will kill you and claim self-defense. I can't watch an innocent man die because I came to this town. Neither can I, Miller said, appearing from the stairwell. But she's right. We walk into that, we're dead, and Clay wins. We need to be smarter. Calder forced himself to think past the rage, past the immediate need to act. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. Do it the right way. The mine, he said. Tonight's operation. We stick to the plan. We get the evidence, and Clay hangs for everything he's done. That man out there doesn't have until tonight, Doc Harlan said from the doorway, his medical bag in hand, but useless against the violence unfolding. They were trapped by tactics and timing, by the knowledge that rushing out would only add their bodies to the count. And then, unexpectedly, salvation came from an unlikely source. Sheriff Garrett pushed through Clay's men, knocking one aside with more force than anyone thought he still possessed. He stood between Pike and the kneeling man, hand on his gun, facing down the outlaw with something that looked like his old self, rising from years of compromise. That's enough, Garrett said, his voice carrying the authority of law, even if everyone knew the law in Red Butte was whatever Clay said it was. This doesn't concern you. Sheriff, Clay replied, a man being executed without trial concerns me plenty. It's called murder, and I won't allow it. You won't allow it. Clay's laugh was ugly. You'll allow whatever I tell you to allow. You've been doing it for years. Then I guess I'm done. Garrett unbadged himself, holding the tarnished star in his palm. I should have done this years ago. Should have stood up when Thomas died. Should have stood up when that mountain man's wife got poisoned. But I was too afraid, too convinced that keeping a false peace was worth the price of my soul. He dropped the badge in the dirt. But I'm not afraid anymore. And I'm not moving. You want to kill this man, you'll have to kill me first. The street was absolutely silent. Clay's face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, calculation, fury. Pike's gun was already drawn, but even he seemed uncertain about gunning down a lawman. Former badge or not, you're making a mistake, Clay said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. The mistake was trusting you to know where the line is. Garrett pulled his gun, not pointing it at anyone but making his position clear. This stops now. No more burnings, no more killings, no more terrorizing this town. Other townspeople were emerging now, emboldened by Garrett's stand. Not many, but enough. The blacksmith, the widow, a few ranch hands who'd kept their heads down until this moment. They formed a loose semicircle around Garrett and the feed store owner, a human wall of quiet defiance. Clay saw the odds shifting, saw the town's fear finally cracking. He couldn't back down without looking weak. But pushing forward would mean bloodshed that even his corruption couldn't cover up. Cut him loose, Clay finally ordered Pike, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Pike hesitated, then complied. The feed store owner stumbled away, helped by neighbors. The fire still burned, destroying a livelihood but at least not a life. Clay pointed at Garrett. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Garrett picked up his badge, studied it for a moment, then pinned it back on his shirt. And I'm still the law in Red Butte, even if that law's been sleeping. Consider it awake now. Clay rode off with his men, but the threat in his departure was unmistakable. This wasn't over. It was escalating. Back in the room above the general store, the group reconvened. What had seemed like a tragic morning had somehow transformed into a rallying point. Garrett's stand had given others permission to find their own courage. "Tonight," Calder said firmly. "We can't wait any longer. Clay's going to move against us with everything he has. Our only chance is to get that evidence and force the territorial marshal to act before Clay can bury us all." "I'll go with you," Garrett said. "I owe Thomas that much. I owe this town that much." They spent the day preparing. Calder and Miller would approach the mine from the east, using the terrain for cover. Garrett and Doc would create a distraction on the western approach, drawing off guards. Rook would serve as early warning, and if necessary, as a weapon nothing could prepare for. Eliza insisted on remaining at the store, ready to ride for help if things went wrong. She also produced a leather pouch of raw silver ore she'd been keeping, a sample Sarah had collected 5 years ago before the poison took hold. "She got this from the mine," Eliza explained. "Snuck in one night while Clay was in town. It's evidence, but more important, you can match it to whatever you find tonight. Proves the operation's been running at least 5 years. As the sun set on Red Butte, 4 men and a wolf dog prepared for a mission that would either free the town or get them all killed. They checked weapons, reviewed the plan, and in the quiet moments before action, made peace with the possibility they might not see another dawn." Doc Harlan pulled out his son's compass, held it for a long moment, then put it in his pocket. "For luck," he said. "For justice," Garrett corrected. "For Sarah," Calder added quietly. They moved out in darkness, leaving behind a town holding its breath. In his house, Clay Maddox was mobilizing his men, preparing for war. And somewhere in the mountains, the disputed land waited with its secrets buried beneath silver and blood. The night would reveal which was stronger, the law of men or the law of money and violence. Calder touched Sarah's wedding band one more time, then followed Rook into the darkness, ready for whatever came next. The approach to the mine took 2 hours of careful movement through terrain that favored defenders. Calder and Miller moved like shadows, with Rook ranging ahead, his night vision and hearing better than any humans. The wolf dog would pause occasionally, ears forward, testing the wind for scents that didn't belong. The mine entrance was exactly where Sarah's map had indicated, a timber-framed opening in a hillside, concealed by scrub pine and positioned to be invisible unless you knew where to look. 2 guards sat by a fire, rifles within reach but not held, their attention on a bottle passing between them rather than on the darkness around them. "Sloppy," Miller whispered. "They're not expecting trouble. Or they're bait," Calder countered, studying the approaches. Something felt wrong about how exposed the guards were, how easy this seemed. Then Rook's hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Not directed at the guards by the fire, but at something else, something behind them. Calder spun, just as Pike emerged from the darkness, gun drawn, and pointed at Miller's head. "Thought you might try something like this," Pike said, his dead eyes reflecting firelight. Clay figured the mountain man for stupid. Glad to see he was right. More men appeared, 8 of them, surrounding the position. They'd walked right into a trap. "Drop your weapons," Pike ordered. Calder's mind raced through options. They were outnumbered, outpositioned, and outmaneuvered. Fighting would just get Miller killed. He lowered his rifle slowly, and Miller did the same with his pistol. "The wolf, too," Pike said. "Call him off or I'll shoot him." "Rook, down," Calder commanded. The wolf dog obeyed reluctantly, muscles still coiled for violence, but disciplined enough to wait for the signal. "Smart dog." Pike's smile was cold. "Clay wants to talk to you. Both of you. You're gonna help us solve a problem." They were marched into the mine, past the guards who'd been bait just as Calder suspected. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber lit by oil lamps, and what Calder saw there made him understand the true scope of Clay's operation. This wasn't a simple mining operation. It was a full-scale industrial enterprise. Ore carts, smelting equipment, timber supports that spoke of extensive excavation. Thousands of dollars in infrastructure, all built on land Clay didn't own. And there, in a corner of the chamber, were bones. Human bones, partially buried in rockfall. Thomas, Miller breathed, his face going pale. Doc's son had been here, just as they'd suspected. But the horror of seeing confirmation, of knowing those remains, had been lying in darkness for 3 years, hit like a physical blow. Clay Maddox stood in the center of the chamber, looking pleased with himself. Welcome to the Silver Creek mine. Impressive, isn't it? Took me 5 years to build all this. 5 years of planning, investment, careful management. 5 years of theft and murder, Calder said quietly. Perspective, Clay replied with a shrug. I saw opportunity where others saw rocks and dirt. That's called vision. It's called crime. Miller's voice shook with rage. You killed Thomas. You killed Mrs. Boone. How many others? Only the ones who couldn't mind their own business. Clay walked toward Thomas's remains, almost casual. Young deputy here started asking questions, making noise about land claims and legal documents. So I invited him up here for a tour, showed him the operation, made him an offer. He refused. Tried to arrest me, if you can believe that. Pike had to handle it. Handle it, Calder repeated, the words like ash in his mouth. Rock fall. Tragic accident. These mines are dangerous. Clay's smile was reptilian. Same thing happened to Sarah Boone, or would have if the poison hadn't finished the job first. She was more stubborn than Thomas, actually. Came here twice, took samples, thought she was being clever. Had to take more permanent measures. The admission hung in the chamber. Calder's hand slowly moved toward the knife at his belt, but Pike's gun tracked the movement. Easy, Pike warned. Clay wants to talk. After that, we'll see. Here's the situation, Clay continued, enjoying his captive audience. Tomorrow, I'm presenting the town council with a petition to incorporate the Silver Creek mine into Red Butte's municipal holdings. I've got enough signatures from townspeople who depend on my money to make it legal. Once it's incorporated, any challenge to my ownership becomes a challenge to the town itself. The territorial judge, who happens to be a business partner, will rule in favor of municipal rights over individual land claims. That won't work, Calder said. The original deed will disappear, along with Thomas's ledger, which I'm guessing Doc Harlan has hidden somewhere. And along with you two, of course. Clay's expression turned serious. But here's the thing. I'm not a monster. I'm a businessman. And right now, you two represent a problem that could be solved with either violence or negotiation. You're offering us a deal, Miller said flatly. I'm offering you life. Yours, your families, everyone who stood with you yesterday morning. You leave Red Butte tonight, never come back, never speak about what you've seen or heard, and everyone lives. The town gets the economic benefits of the mine, I get to continue my operation without interference, and you get to watch your daughter grow up. Clay looked at Calder. You get to walk away with your life and your dog. That's more than Sarah got. The calculation was clear. They could kill them, but bodies had a way of creating problems, especially when townspeople were already suspicious. Better to buy silence, to send them running and let fear keep them quiet. And if we refuse... Calder asked, though he already knew the answer. Then I make examples of you. Public, brutal examples that make sure no one else in Red Butte ever questions me again. Clay's voice went cold. Your choice. Life or martyrdom, but decide fast. My patience has limits. Miller looked at Calder, and in that glance was everything they'd fought for. Justice for Thomas, for Sarah, for a town living under tyranny. Taking the deal meant abandoning all of it. Fighting meant dying and possibly taking others with them. Before either could answer, Rook moved. Not attacking, just shifting position, and one of Clay's men panicked and fired. The shot went wide, but it changed everything. The wolf dog exploded into motion, hitting the shooter and taking him down in a snarl of fur and fangs. The chamber erupted into chaos. Pike turned toward Rook, and Calder used the distraction to rush him. They collided hard, going down in a tangle. Miller dove for his confiscated gun. The other guards were firing at Rook, but the wolf dog was too fast, moving between the ore carts and equipment, like grey lightning. Calder got his hands on Pike's gun, forcing it away just as it discharged. The bullet ricocheted off stone, and then they were rolling, struggling for control of the weapon. Pike was younger, but Calder had spent decades surviving in country that didn't forgive mistakes. He got leverage, twisted, and the gun came free. Miller had retrieved his weapon and was returning fire, keeping Clay's men pinned. Rook had disabled 2 more guards, not killing but removing them from the fight with savage efficiency. Clay was running deeper into the mine, and Calder went after him, leaving Pike groaning with a bullet in his shoulder. The tunnel branched, but Calder could hear Clay ahead, boots on stone. Breathing heavy with fear and exertion, they emerged into another chamber, this one containing Clay's real secret, not just silver ore, but a makeshift office with ledgers, maps, documents detailing 5 years of illegal operations. And there, in a safe that stood open in Clay's panic, were stacks of correspondence. Calder grabbed a handful, scanning quickly. Letters to the territorial judge, to politicians, to businessmen in Denver and San Francisco. Detailed accounts of bribery, kickbacks, and conspiracy. This wasn't just theft. It was corruption that reached far beyond Red Butte. Clay stood at the far end of the chamber, his ornate revolver finally drawn. "That doesn't leave this mine," he said, his voice shaking. "It's already too late." Calder carefully set the documents down, his own rifle aimed steady at Clay. "Doc Harlan has copies. So does Eliza. We came here for proof, but we already had enough to hang you. This just seals it. You're bluffing, am I?" Thomas documented everything. Sarah's letter detailed her poisoning. Eliza kept the original deed. "You've already lost, Clay. Only question now is whether you face justice or run like the coward you are." Clay's gun trembled. In his eyes, Calder could see the moment the outlaw realized his empire was crumbling, that all his planning and violence had been for nothing. "I built something here," Clay said, almost pleading. "An empire, a legacy. You built a grave," Calder replied. "You just didn't realize you were digging it for yourself." The shot, when it came, wasn't from Clay's ornate revolver. It was from behind Calder, and he turned to see Sheriff Garrett standing in the tunnel entrance. Rifle smoking, Clay dropped, clutching his leg, his gun clattering away across stone. "That's for Thomas," Garrett said quietly. "And Sarah, and everyone else you hurt while I looked the other way." The distraction on the western approach had been cover for Garrett and Doc to follow Calder and Miller in. They'd arrived just in time to hear Clay's confession, to witness his attempt to murder Calder, to finally act on years of accumulated guilt. Doc Harlan rushed past them toward the first chamber, heading for his son's remains. The sound of his grief echoed through the tunnels, a father's anguish finally given voice after 3 years of not knowing. Outside, they could hear more men coming. Clay's reinforcements drawn by the gunfire. But it was too late. The evidence was secured. Clay was wounded and captured, and Red Butte's long nightmare was finally ending. Calder gathered the documents, securing them carefully. Miller helped him, while Garrett stood guard over Clay, who was cursing and bleeding but alive. Rook appeared from the darkness, blood on his muzzle but moving without injury. He'd eliminated 5 of Clay's men without taking a single bullet. The wolf dog sat beside Calder, mission accomplished, waiting for the next command. "Good boy," Calder murmured, touching the animal's scarred head. "Good boy." The reinforcements turned out to be townspeople, not Clay's men. Word had spread when the shooting started, and Red Butte's citizens had made their choice. They came armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, even farming implements, ready to stand against whatever came next. When they saw Clay wounded and captured, when Garrett explained what they'd found, the evidence, the confession, Thomas's remains, something shifted in the collective soul of the town. Years of fear began to crack and fall away like winter ice in spring sun. They carried Clay back to town on a makeshift stretcher, Garrett and Miller flanking him with loaded rifles. Doc Harlan insisted on bringing Thomas's remains, refusing to leave his son in the darkness any longer. The procession through Red Butte streets at dawn was somber, meaningful, like a wound finally being cleaned even if the process hurt. But the danger wasn't over. Clay's men were still out there, those who hadn't been at the mine, those loyal more to violence than to the man himself. And then there was the broader conspiracy, the web of corruption Clay had woven with politicians and judges. "We need to move fast," Garrett said, gathering Calder, Miller, Doc, and Eliza in the jail. Clay was locked in a cell, his leg bandaged, but his spirit thoroughly broken. Clay's connections will start working the moment they hear he's captured. "We need that evidence in the territorial marshal's hands before anyone can make it disappear." "I'll ride," Calder offered. "Take the documents and Thomas's ledger. Get to the territorial capital within 3 days." "You'd never make it alone," Miller protested. "Clay's men are watching the roads. The moment you ride out, they'll be after you. Not if they don't know I'm gone." Calder was already formulating a plan. "What if I leave at night, take back trails instead of main roads? Rook can scout ahead, warn me of ambushes." "Still too risky," Doc said. "We need another approach. What if we bring the marshal here instead? Send a telegram. Tell him we've got evidence of corruption involving a territorial judge. That'll get his attention." "The telegraph office is run by one of Clay's cousins," Eliza pointed out. "Send that message, and every gun hand between here and the capital will know about it within hours." They were circling the problem, each solution revealing new complications. Time was against them, and the enemies they faced had resources, connections, and nothing to lose. Then Miller had an idea. "What if we do both? Send a decoy rider on the main road, someone who looks like they're carrying important documents. Meanwhile, Calder takes the real evidence on a back route. The ambushers hit the decoy, think they've stopped us, while the truth gets through anyway. That decoy would be taking on enormous risk," Garrett observed. "I'll do it," a voice said from the doorway. It was the feed store owner, the man who'd nearly been executed the morning before. "Clay burned my livelihood. Let me return the favor by burning his last chance at freedom." Others volunteered too. The blacksmith, the widow, even the nervous telegraph clerk who revealed he'd been documenting Clay's messages for months. Insurance against the day his conscience finally outweighed his fear. A plan emerged, complex and risky, but possible. They'd create multiple decoys, send riders out in different directions, overwhelm Clay's remaining men with targets to chase. The real evidence would go with Calder on the least expected route, through the high country, over trails that most men wouldn't attempt on horseback, through territory that would be brutal but passable for someone who knew mountains. "When do we start?" the feed store owner asked. "Dawn tomorrow," Garrett decided. "Gives us time to prepare, and gives anyone watching us time to assume we're planning for later rather than sooner." That day was spent in careful preparation. Calder plotted his route using Sarah's old maps, identifying water sources and shelter points. Miller worked with the decoy riders, making sure each carried convincing fake documents. Doc prepared supplies, medical gear, food, ammunition. Eliza organized the townspeople who'd stand watch, making sure Clay's remaining men didn't try a direct assault on the jail. The real documents were carefully secured in oilcloth and leather, protected from weather and rough handling. Calder would carry them in his pack, along with the original deed, Thomas's ledger, and the most damning correspondence from Clay's office safe. That evening, as the sun painted Red Butte in shades of amber and gold, Calder found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time since the chaos had begun. He sat on the jail's back porch, Rook beside him, and pulled out Sarah's photograph. She smiled at him from across 5 years of grief and searching. He traced the outline of her face with his finger, remembering her laugh, her fierce determination, the way she'd challenged him to be better than he thought he could be. "Almost done," he told her softly. "Almost there." Doc Halian joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to Calder and sat down heavily, exhaustion showing in every line of his weathered face. "Thomas would have been 30 next month," Doc said after a long silence. "I had his birthday marked on the calendar, even though I knew he was gone. Couldn't quite make myself stop hoping. Hope's not a weakness. Sometimes it feels like one." Doc sipped his coffee. "But then I think about what we found today, how we finally got justice for him, and I realize hope was what kept me going. hoped that the truth would come out. That he didn't die for nothing. He didn't. None of them did. Calder looked at the mountains in the distance, the route he'd be taking tomorrow. They died standing for something real. That counts for more than most people's whole lives. You remind me so much of Thomas, Doc said. That same stubborn sense of right and wrong. That same refusal to compromise when it matters. Sarah was like that too. Maybe that's why I loved her so much. Calder smiled sadly. She was braver than I ever was. Coming here alone, facing down Clay, getting evidence even while he was poisoning her. By the time she realized how sick she was, she'd already done the hard part. She just needed someone to finish it, and you did. She'd be proud. I hope so. Calder touched the wedding band at his neck. I promised her I'd do it the right way. That meant not killing Clay when I had the chance, letting the law handle it. That was harder than any fight I've ever been in. They sat in comfortable silence, two men who'd found unexpected friendship through shared loss. The night settled over Red Butte, bringing with it a sense of anticipation. Tomorrow would determine whether their sacrifices had meaning, or whether Clay's corruption would win one final victory. Inside the jail, Garrett was talking with Clay through the cell bars. Calder could hear their voices, low and intense. You could have been something, Garrett was saying. You had ambition, drive, vision, could have built something legitimate, something to be proud of. I did build something, Clay replied, his voice bitter. An empire, more wealth than 3 generations could spend. That's not nothing. It's worse than nothing. It's everything that's wrong with men who think money buys them immunity from conscience. Garrett's voice hardened. You killed good people. You corrupted a whole town. You turned law into a joke and justice into something you could purchase. That's your legacy, Clay. Not the silver, not the wealth. Just the trail of bodies you left behind. Clay had no response to that. What response was there? The truth of his crimes was undeniable now, documented in his own hand, witnessed by multiple people, proven by evidence that no amount of bribery could erase. As night deepened, Miller made his rounds, checking on the decoy riders and making sure everyone understood the morning's plan. He stopped by where Calder sat, looking younger than his years and more uncertain than he wanted to admit. Never shot at a person before today, Miller confessed. Never thought I'd have to. It changes you, Calder acknowledged. Taking a life or even just being willing to. Something shifts inside that you can't shift back. Do you regret it? The men you've killed? Calder thought about that. I regret needing to. I regret living in a world where violence sometimes becomes necessary. But I don't regret protecting what needed protecting or standing for what needed standing for. That's what Sarah asked you to do, Miller said. Stand for something. Protect something. Do it the right way, even when the wrong way would be easier. She had high expectations. She knew you could meet them. Miller smiled slightly. My daughter's middle name is going to be Sarah, after your wife. After what she stood for. I want my girl to grow up knowing that courage doesn't always look like gunfights and dramatic stands. Sometimes it looks like a woman gathering evidence even while being poisoned. Sometimes it's a quiet kind of brave that changes everything. Calder felt his throat tighten. That's a good name. A good legacy. The night deepened further. One by one, the lights in Red Butte went out as people sought what rest they could before the morning's trials. But in the jail, in the general store, in a dozen homes throughout town, people lay awake, thinking about the choice they'd made to finally stand against tyranny. Calder didn't sleep. He sat with Rook, checking his gear repeatedly, reviewing the route in his mind, thinking through contingencies and problems. The wolf dog sensed his tension and stayed close, offering silent companionship. Around midnight, Eliza brought food, dried meat, hard bread, cheese that would travel well. She also brought something else, a small leather journal, its pages blank. For after, she said simply. For when this is done and you need to write down what happened, so people remember. So Sarah's story gets told the way it should be told. Calder accepted it, touched by the gesture. I'm not much for writing. You'll find the words when you need them. You found them for everything else. She squeezed his shoulder. Ride safe tomorrow. Come back alive. Red Butte needs good men like you. Red Butte has good people already. They just forgot for a while. Maybe, but sometimes it takes an outsider to remind us who we are. She left him then, and Calder was alone with his thoughts and his wolf dog and the weight of what tomorrow would bring. He cleaned his rifle one more time, checked the documents one more time, touched Sarah's wedding band one more time. For you, he whispered to the night, all of this, for you. And somewhere in the darkness, he could almost feel her presence, almost hear her voice encouraging him forward. The woman he'd loved, the woman who'd started this journey 5 years ago with courage and determination, was still with him in the ways that mattered. Dawn was coming. Justice was coming. And Calder Boone, mountain man and widower, was ready to see this through to whatever end awaited in the high country between here and the territorial capital. Rook lifted his head, scenting something on the wind, then settled again.
All clear!
Already, the final act was about to begin. They traveled through the night, sacrificing concealment for speed. If Clay's hired guns were watching the approaches, then timing mattered more than stealth. Get through before they could properly position. Hit them where they didn't expect when they didn't expect. By dawn of the second day, they'd covered ground that should have taken 3. The horses were exhausted, and both men were running on determination more than energy. But they were close now, maybe 12 hours from the territorial capital if they pushed hard. The ambush came at midday in a canyon where the trail narrowed between steep walls. Garrett saw it first, a glint of sunlight on metal high up on the canyon rim. He yanked Calder's horse aside just as the first shot rang out. The bullet passed through the space where Calder's head had been a heartbeat before. They dove for cover behind a boulder outcropping as more shots followed, echoing off stone walls, creating confusion about how many shooters and where they were positioned. 3 above us, Garrett called, pointing. Maybe more we can't see. Rook was already moving, scrambling up the canyon wall with the agility of a wild animal. The wolf dog disappeared into the rocks, and moments later, a scream indicated he'd found one of the shooters. That gave Calder the opening he needed. He broke from cover, running for a position that would give him a better angle on the remaining shooters. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet, but he made it, sliding behind another boulder and bringing his rifle up. There, a man in a grey duster, reloading. Calder's shot was careful, measured, hitting the man in the shoulder and sending him tumbling backward. Not a kill shot, but enough to remove him from the fight. Garrett was returning fire, keeping the other shooters pinned. 2 more men appeared from the canyon floor. They'd been waiting below, planning to cut off any escape. The sheriff's rifle spoke twice, and both men went down, 5 accounted for. And more somewhere, according to the information Garrett had extracted. The canyon fell silent except for the wind and the distant sound of Rook still engaged with someone above. Calder scanned the rim, looking for that last shooter, the one who'd be smart enough to wait for the perfect moment. Movement to the left, a shadow shifting. Calder swung his rifle but wasn't fast enough. The shot came from an unexpected angle, and he felt fire blossom in his side, just below the ribs. He went down hard, his rifle clattering away across stone. Garrett turned, saw Calder down, and charged toward the shooter's position with a roar that was pure rage. The man tried to shift aim, but he was too slow. Garrett's rifle butt caught him across the jaw, and he dropped like a felled tree. Then it was over. 6 men down, the ambush broken. Garrett rushed to Calder's side, already pulling bandages from his pack. "How bad?" the sheriff asked, his hand surprisingly steady as he examined the wound. "Through and through," Calder grunted, feeling the exit wound in his back. "Missed anything vital, I think. You think?" Garrett was already packing the wounds, applying pressure. "We need to get you to a doctor. We need to get these documents to the marshal." Calder tried to sit up, nearly passed out from the pain. "That's what matters. You're what matters." Sarah would want the job finished." Calder's voice was firm despite the agony. "Help me up. We're close. We can make it." Rook appeared above them, descending the canyon wall with blood on his muzzle, but moving without injury. The wolf dog went immediately to Calder, whining softly, pressing his nose against his companion's face. "I'm okay, boy," Calder lied. "We've got work to finish." With Garrett's help, he got back on his horse. The sheriff lashed him into the saddle, making sure he wouldn't fall, then mounted his own horse. They rode out of that canyon of death, leaving behind 6 hired killers who'd bet their lives on Clay's money and lost. The last stretch to the territorial capital was a blur of pain and determination. Calder drifted in and out of consciousness, held upright by rope and Garrett's constant vigilance. Rook ranged ahead, no longer scouting for threats but simply leading them forward, as if the wolf dog understood the urgency. Late afternoon sun was painting the territorial capital's buildings in gold when they finally rode in. Garrett went straight to the marshal's office, half carrying Calder, the documents clutched in his other hand. Marshal Webb was a hard man with honest eyes, the kind who'd survived in frontier law enforcement by being both tough and fair. He took one look at Calder's condition, at the blood-soaked bandages and pale face, and called for a doctor before asking any questions. But when Garrett laid out the documents, the deed, the ledger, the correspondence, Sarah's letter, Webb's expression shifted from concern to grim determination. "This is bigger than I thought," the marshal said, studying the evidence. "This implicates Judge Brennan, at least 3 territorial officials, and half a dozen businessmen. Can you prosecute?" Garrett asked. "Can and will." Webb looked at Calder, who was barely conscious on the officer's couch. "Your friend here just handed me the biggest corruption case this territory's ever seen. Clay Maddox is going to hang, along with several others." "Good," Calder managed to whisper. "That's good." Then the darkness took him, and he knew nothing more. 3 weeks later, Calder stood on a hill overlooking Red Butte, his side still tender but healing. The wound had been serious but not fatal, and the territorial capital's doctor had been skilled enough to prevent infection. Garrett had stayed with him through the recovery, keeping him updated on developments that seemed to arrive daily like a cascade of long-delayed justice. Clay Maddox had been tried and convicted of multiple murders, theft, conspiracy, and corruption. The trial took 4 days, and the verdict took the jury 20 minutes. He'd been hanged a week ago, and Garrett reported that the outlaw had gone to his death still protesting that he'd only done what any ambitious man would do. Judge Brennan and 2 territorial officials faced their own trials. The network of corruption Clay had built was being systematically dismantled, exposing years of graft and illegal activity. The territorial governor himself had gotten involved, determined to clean house and restore faith in frontier law. But the news that meant the most to Calder was simpler and more personal. Thomas Harlan had been buried with honor. His name cleared, his sacrifice recognized. Doc had been there, finally able to properly mourn his son, finally able to let go of years of not knowing. Now Calder stood on this hill with Rook beside him, looking down at the town that had changed so much in such a short time. The feed store was being rebuilt, the community coming together to help the owner who'd nearly died for standing up to tyranny. New businesses were opening. People walked the streets without that furtive glance over their shoulder, without the fear that had defined Red Butte for too long. "Thought I'd find you here," a voice said behind him. Doc Harlan, carrying his medical bag as always, but with something lighter in his step. "How's the side?" "Healing. You taught that doctor in the capital well. He was my student, actually, years ago. Good man, skilled hands." Doc stood beside him, looking out at the view. "You planning to stay?" "Thinking about it." Calder gestured toward the disputed land visible in the distance. "The deed's legally mine now. Sarah's inheritance, passed to me as her widower. The mine, the land, all of it. That's a fortune in silver still in the ground. It is." Calder was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what to do with it." What Sarah would have wanted. And the town needs a school. A real one, not just some room where kids learn when harvest doesn't need them. A school with a teacher, books, a building that doesn't leak when it rains. Calder pulled out the deed, studied it. Figure the silver from that mine could fund it for generations. Call it the Sarah Carson Boone School. Let her name mean something good, something that lasts beyond revenge and justice. Doc's eyes glistened. That's a fine legacy, better than she'd have hoped for. She deserves better than I can give. But it's a start. They walked down the hill together, Rook ranging ahead as always. In town, people greeted Calder with respect and genuine warmth. The mountain man who'd come seeking justice had become part of Red Butte's story, woven into the fabric of its redemption. At the general store, Eliza was waiting with news. "Letter came for you," she said, handing over an official-looking envelope. "From the territorial governor." Inside was a commendation for service to law and order, along with a formal thank you for exposing corruption. There was also an offer, a position as territorial marshal for the region, should Calder want it. "What will you say?" Eliza asked. "I'll say thank you, but no." Calder folded the letter carefully. "I'm not a lawman. I'm just a man who kept a promise. Some promises change the world. Some do." He looked around the store, remembering the first time he'd walked in, when Sarah's journey had still been a mystery and justice had seemed impossible. "I'm thinking I might stay around here, help get the school built. Maybe do some mining myself. Nothing industrial, just enough to fund things." This was Sarah's land, her family's land. Feels right to honor that. Sheriff Garrett stopped by that evening, his badge polished for the first time in years. Miller had been promoted to deputy marshal, given responsibility for regional law enforcement. The old sheriff was training him, passing on decades of hard-won wisdom about keeping peace without compromising principles. "The territorial governor wants to know if you'd testify in the corruption trials," Garrett said. "Your statement about what Clay admitted in the mine would be powerful evidence." "I'll testify. As many times as it takes." Calder touched the wedding band still hanging from his neck. "For Sarah, for Thomas, for everyone who suffered while corruption wore the badge of law." That night, Calder sat with Doc, Miller, Garrett, and Eliza around a table in the general store's back room. They shared a bottle of whiskey, toasting absent friends and hard-won victories. The conversation was easy, comfortable, the kind that comes when people have been through fire together and emerged on the other side. "To Sarah," Doc said, raising his glass, "who started this journey and gave us the map to follow." "To Thomas," Miller added, who tried to fight corruption alone and paid the ultimate price. "To justice," Garrett said quietly. "However long it takes, however hard the road." They drank in silence, each lost in thoughts of the journey that had brought them here. Later, Calder walked to the edge of town, where a small cemetery held the graves of those Red Butte had lost over the years. There was a new marker there now, placed by Doc with Calder's help. Thomas Harlan, deputy marshal, died serving justice. 1847-1873, his courage lives on. Calder knelt beside it, Rook sitting nearby. "We did it, Thomas," he said softly. "Got justice for you, for Sarah, for all of them. Your death wasn't for nothing. Your father knows that now. The whole territory knows it." He pulled out his leather journal, the one Eliza had given him, and began to write by moonlight. The story of Red Butte, of corruption and courage, of a mountain man and his wolf dog who'd refused to let injustice stand. The story of Sarah, who'd started this journey knowing it might cost her life. The story of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when it mattered most. The words came easier than he'd expected, flowing from his pen like water finding its course downhill. He wrote about loyalty, not just Rook's loyalty to him, but the loyalty we owe to truth, to justice, to the memory of those who've gone before. When he finally closed the journal, dawn was breaking over Red Butte. The town was stirring, beginning another day. But this day was different from the ones that had come before. This was a day built on truth instead of fear, on justice instead of corruption. Calder stood, touched Sarah's wedding band one final time, and turned toward the rising sun. Behind him the past, grief and loss and the hard journey of seeking justice. Ahead, the future, a school to build, a town to help heal, a life to live in a place Sarah had loved. Rook pressed against his leg, and together they walked back into Red Butte, into whatever came next. The mountain man and his wolf dog, bound by loyalty deeper than words, ready for whatever new challenges awaited. Sometimes a man finds a loyalty so deep that no threat on earth can break it. Calder had found it twice, in a woman's love and in a wolf dog's devotion. And both had taught him the same truth. Loyalty isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing firm when everything tells you to run. That's what Sarah had done. That's what Thomas had done. That's what Calder had done. And in the end, standing firm had changed everything.